2 named storms, 0 hurricanes. That is everything the Atlantic Ocean has produced this year, and this morning the National Hurricane Center forecast nothing at all for the next 7 days. Now cross to the other side of the planet, where the West Pacific has already built multiple Category 5 super typhoons, one of them driving a 180-mile-per-hour eye directly across American soil, and tonight it is building another, aimed at a coastline holding tens of millions of people. Same week, same planet. One ocean cannot start a single storm while the other cannot stop making monsters. That split is not luck. It is the fingerprint of one enormous force, still growing, and the last 2 times it looked exactly like this. The silence was not the danger passing. It was the danger being saved for later. So like this video and subscribe to the Sky Lab, because this story is moving by the hour and the next 2 weeks are where it gets decided. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from, and whether a quiet hurricane season near you feels like relief or a warning. Let's get into it. Part 1. 2 oceans, 1 week. On July 23, 2026, a tropical storm named Bertha died over south-central Texas. It did not go out in a blaze of destruction. It went out the way a candle goes out in a drafty room, starved, tilted, pulled apart from above until there was nothing left holding it together. The National Hurricane Center quietly reclassified it as an open trough, which is the meteorological equivalent of a death certificate. Bertha was the second named storm of the entire Atlantic season, and it never even reached hurricane strength. It topped out at around 40 knots, roughly 45 miles per hour, before the atmosphere itself tore it to pieces. Now hold that image in your mind, because at almost the same moment, on the other side of the planet, the ocean was building something. On July 24th, in the Philippine Sea, about 324 nautical miles northeast of Manila, a swirl of thunderstorms organized itself into Tropical Storm Nool. The Joint Typhoon Warning Center, the United States military's forecasting arm for the Pacific, looked at the satellite data and described a highly dynamic, rapidly organizing wind field. Their forecast calls for near-rapid intensification within the first 12 hours. The water beneath this storm is running 30 to 31 degrees Celsius, bathtub warm and deep. The forecast track carries it across the northern tip of Luzon, out over the South China Sea, and into the coast of southern China within about 48 hours. One of the world's premier forecast models, the American GFS, currently places the core of this storm within 25 nautical miles of Hong Kong. So here is the picture, and I want you to really see it. The Atlantic Ocean, the basin that gave the world Katrina, Andrew, Maria, the basin that Americans watch with dread every summer, cannot currently start a storm, not weaken one, not steer one away, start one. The National Hurricane Center's official outlook, issued at 8 in the morning Eastern Time on July 24th, says tropical cyclone formation is not expected anywhere in the North Atlantic, the Caribbean Sea, or the Gulf for the next 7 days. Not a hurricane, not a tropical storm, not even a depression, nothing. And a widely shared analysis of the long-range models circulating among forecasters online extends that window even further. No cyclonic activity expected in the Atlantic for at least the next 15 days, and possibly beyond. Meanwhile, the West Pacific has already produced multiple Category 5 super typhoons this year, including one that put its eye directly over United States soil with 180-mile-per-hour winds. And it is building another storm right now, aimed at one of the most densely populated coastlines on Earth. 2 oceans, same planet, same week. One of them is dead, the other one is a factory. If these were independent facts, they would each be interesting on their own. A quiet Atlantic happens sometimes, a violent Pacific happens sometimes, but they are not independent facts, and that is the entire story I want to tell you tonight. The silence in one ocean and the violence in the other are being caused by the same thing. They are 2 readings from a single planetary engine, an engine that has been spinning up beneath the tropical Pacific for the past 6 months, faster than almost anyone forecast, and which is now reaching across half the circumference of the Earth and deciding, basin by basin, which oceans get storms this year and which do not. That engine is the 2026 El Niño. Before we go further, look at how fast this happened, because the speed is part of the story. In November of 2025, the equatorial Pacific was still in La Niña, the cool phase, the mirror image of what we have now. The official index read minus 0.54 degrees Celsius. By the December through February reading it had softened to minus 0.37, By late winter it was minus 0.14, essentially neutral. Then the spring readings started climbing, plus 0.13, plus 0.51, and now plus 0.98. Underneath those anomaly numbers, the absolute temperature of the benchmark stretch of equatorial ocean, a region forecasters call Niño 3.4, rose from just under 26 degrees Celsius to over 28.7. The World Meteorological Organization and NOAA formally declared El Niño conditions in June, and the declarations came quickly because the ocean was not waiting around for paperwork. 6 months from one phase of the tropical Pacific to the other. Climate scientists sometimes describe the El Niño cycle as a pendulum, but pendulums do not usually swing like this. And the pendulum is swinging across an ocean that was already, before any of this started, the warmest it has ever been in the instrumental record. A detail we covered on this channel about 2 weeks ago, when June's global sea surface temperatures came in at the highest ever measured for the month. Whatever this El Niño becomes, it is becoming it on top of a baseline no previous El Niño ever launched from. You have probably heard the name. You may even have heard that this one could become historic. That the official measurements have it strengthening at a remarkable pace. That forecasters are openly discussing whether it becomes what they call a super El Niño by winter. The number that matters is called the Oceanic Niño Index, and as of the latest official reading it stands at plus 0.98 degrees Celsius. 6 overlapping seasonal readings ago, roughly 6 months, that same index sat at minus 0.54. The tropical Pacific has swung 1.5 degrees Celsius from La Niña territory into solid El Niño territory in about half a year. That is one of the fastest transitions in the modern record. And here is what most coverage gets wrong, or at least incomplete. El Niño is usually explained as a warm patch of water that shifts rain around and bumps up global temperatures. That is true, but it undersells the scale of the thing so badly that it borders on misinformation. El Niño is the largest single rearrangement of heat on this planet short of the seasons themselves. When it switches on, it does not just warm the water, it reorganizes the atmosphere above an entire hemisphere of ocean, where the air rises, where it sinks, where the winds blow at 40,000 feet. And tropical cyclones, the most violent storms this planet produces, live or die by exactly those things. Think of a hurricane for a moment as a machine with 2 requirements. It needs fuel, warm ocean water, the deeper the better, and it needs permission. An atmosphere calm enough in its upper levels to let a vertical tower of thunderstorms stand upright and organize. Take away either one and the machine cannot run. What makes El Niño so consequential for storms is that it adjusts both dials at once, in opposite directions, on opposite sides of the world. Over the Pacific it piles up extra fuel and grants extra permission. Over the Atlantic it leaves the fuel in the tank but revokes permission entirely, stationing rivers of hostile wind over the very latitudes where hurricanes are born. Same engine, 2 dials, half a planet apart. So when the Atlantic goes silent in the middle of what should be its ramp-up season, and the West Pacific starts producing 180-mile-per-hour monsters in the same weeks, that is not a coincidence or a curiosity. That is a fingerprint. It is the visible, measurable signature of how much energy this El Niño is already moving, pressed onto both sides of the planet at once. And a fingerprint, if you know how to read it, tells you what happened. But it can also tell you what happens next, because we have seen this exact 2-ocean pattern before. The dead Atlantic, the rampaging Pacific, the index climbing toward historic territory. It happened in a year that hurricane scientists still talk about with a kind of reverence, a year that produced the most powerful typhoon season ever measured on Earth. And what came after that year, the bill that arrived when the engine finally shut down, is the part of the story almost nobody remembers. So here is how we are going to do this. First, the autopsy. What actually killed the Atlantic season, organ by organ, because the cause of death is stranger and more specific than it's just quiet this year. Then the factory floor, what the Pacific has built since April, and what it is building tonight. Then we open the machine itself, the feedback loop that runs both basins from a strip of water on the equator. And then we go back to the last time this machine ran at full power, because that year did not end when the storm stopped. It ended 14 months later, with the deadliest Atlantic hurricane in more than 2 centuries. We will get there, but first we need to do an autopsy. Because to understand what is being built in the Pacific right now, you first have to understand in precise detail What Just Died in the Gulf. Part 2, Autopsy of a Dead Basin. Let us start with what the 2026 Atlantic hurricane season was supposed to look like. By late July, an average Atlantic season has produced 3 to 4 named storms and is accelerating into its climatological peak. The water is warm. The African easterly waves, the seedlings that become the Great Cape Verde hurricanes, are rolling off the coast every few days like clockwork. Late July is when the basin normally clears its throat, and it is worth understanding why late July matters so much in that climatology. The Atlantic's most dangerous storms, the long-track major hurricane threats, are overwhelmingly born in a strip of ocean between the coast of Africa and the Caribbean called the Main Development Region. Every few days through summer, a ripple of low pressure called an easterly wave rolls off the African coast into that strip. In a normal year by now, those waves are finding warm water and a permissive atmosphere, and the basin starts converting them, first into depressions, then storms, then the August and September monsters. The waves are still coming this year. The African wave train does not care about El Niño. What has changed is what happens to the waves when they arrive. They roll west into an atmosphere that dismantles them, one after another, like a security system quietly deleting intruders. Instead of converting those waves, the 2026 Atlantic has managed exactly 2 named storms, and calling them storms almost feels generous. Arthur came first, back in June, a homegrown system close to the coast that we covered at the time, mostly for its rainfall, because it stalled and soaked an already saturated deep south. Then came Bertha, and Bertha is where this season stopped being merely quiet and became diagnostic. Bertha formed in the Gulf in mid-July, out of a disturbance forecasters had watched for days with genuine uncertainty about whether it would develop at all. We actually covered that disturbance on this channel in our video from July 19th about the storm forecasters were bracing for off the Gulf Coast. 3 different forecast offices published 3 contradictory scenarios for the same system on the same morning. What eventually emerged was a storm that struggled for every knot of intensity it ever had. Bertha peaked as a weak tropical storm crawling along the Gulf Coast, and the reason it could not strengthen was visible on every satellite loop: wind shear. Powerful upper-level winds, blowing at a completely different speed and direction than the surface winds, were physically tearing the storm's structure apart faster than the warm Gulf water could rebuild it. Thunderstorms would fire near the centre, get sheared hundreds of miles downwind, and dissolve. The storm's engine kept trying to start, and the atmosphere kept ripping the engine out of the car. It is worth pausing on what wind shear actually does to a storm, because the mechanism explains everything else in this video. A tropical cyclone is, structurally, a chimney. Warm, moist air rises through the centre, condenses into towering thunderstorms, releases heat, and that released heat drives more rising air, a self-reinforcing loop that can spin up from a cluster of storms to a hurricane in days. But the chimney only works if it stands vertical. When winds at 40,000 feet blow 40 knots faster than the winds at the surface, the top of the chimney gets dragged downwind of the bottom. The storm tilts. The rising heat vents off to one side instead of stacking over the centre. Dry air pours into the exposed core. The pressure stops falling, the thunderstorms collapse, and the whole structure unravels. Shear does not fight a storm the way land does, by starvation. Shear dismembers it. On the satellite loops of Bertha's final days, you could watch the process in time-lapse. A naked, exposed swirl of low clouds with all its thunderstorms smeared 100 miles to the northeast like a campfire in a gale. Forecast coverage at the time said the quiet part out loud. The winds shredding Bertha were a preview of the entire season, because that shear pattern is the #1 calling card of El Niño. By July 23rd, Bertha was gone, dissipated into an open trough over south-central Texas. And here is the detail I need you to sit with, because it will matter later in this story. Even that failed, sheared 40-knot storm still put a river in Texas into major flood. As of this morning, July 24th, the Nueces River near Asherton, Texas is in major flooding, with the warning in effect into the weekend. At 27 feet, the flood there cuts off ranch country and starts drowning livestock across the lowlands above Uvalde. Additional flood warnings stretch down the Nueces at Cotulla, at Tilden, at Three Rivers, and along the Frio River. 4 counties are dealing with the aftermath of a storm that, by wind, barely qualified as a storm at all. Remember that. A dead basin is not a safe basin. Water does not care about categories, but in terms of raw cyclone activity, the ledger is stark. 2 storms, 0 hurricanes, the quietest start to an Atlantic season in over a decade, and the forward outlook is emptier still. The National Hurricane Center's tropical weather outlook on the morning of July 24th, signed by forecaster Reinhardt, covering the entire North Atlantic, the Caribbean, and the Gulf, reads, in full, tropical cyclone formation is not expected during the next 7 days. 1 sentence. That is the whole forecast for a third of the tropical northern hemisphere in late July. Understand what that 1 sentence forecast represents. The tropical weather outlook is issued 4 times a day, every day, all season long. It is the product coastal emergency managers check before their morning coffee, the document that starts every hurricane season news cycle. Most late July editions carry at least something, a wave worth watching, a 10% yellow circle, a disturbance with a designation. For it to read completely clean, corner to corner, across 3 sub-basins simultaneously, at the end of July, is the meteorological equivalent of a seismograph, drawing a flat line through an earthquake zone. The instrument is working perfectly. It is the ground that has gone still. Beyond the official 7-day window, the picture darkens further, or brightens depending on which coast you live on. The long-range ensemble models surveyed in an analysis that spread widely among weather watchers this week show essentially nothing forming in the Atlantic for at least the next 15 days. If that verifies, the basin would coast into early August, the on-ramp to its traditional peak, having produced nothing stronger than a shredded tropical storm all year, and measure this quiet against the era it interrupted, because the contrast is what makes it so jarring. The Atlantic of recent memory has been the hyperactive basin, the ocean that produced 30 named storms in a single season in 2020, that burned through its entire alphabetical name list more than once, that delivered Harvey, Irma and Maria in a single ruinous 6-week stretch in 2017. An entire generation of coastal residents has grown up with the assumption that every summer brings a conveyor belt of threats off Africa. That is the psychological backdrop against which 2026 is unfolding. A basin that has spent a decade teaching people to expect too much of it, now producing almost nothing at all. The quietest start in over a decade is not just a statistic. For tens of millions of people from Texas to Maine, it is a season that feels like it belongs to a different ocean. And look at the character of the 2 storms the basin did manage, because it is as diagnostic as the count. Arthur in June and Bertha in July were both homegrown systems, born close to the coastline, inside the Gulf and the near western Atlantic, in the brief local windows where conditions relaxed just enough to let something spin up near land. Neither was a Cape Verde storm. Neither came off the African coast, crossed the open Atlantic on the long conveyor, and built into a major hurricane over days of warm water. The pathway that produces almost every truly dangerous long-lived Atlantic system. That machinery, the assembly line at the eastern end of the basin, never switched on at all. What formed instead were 2 low-end storms scraped together close to home, one of which could not even hold together long enough to reach hurricane strength. This is exactly the fingerprint an El Niño leaves on the Atlantic. Not necessarily 0 storms, but the wrong kind of storms. Weak, brief, born near the coast, while the long track engine that builds the monsters sits idle under a ceiling of hostile wind. Hold that distinction. It is going to matter enormously when we reach 1997, whose Atlantic looked precisely like this before the reckoning that followed. The institution saw this coming, at least in outline. NOAA's seasonal forecast gave a 55% chance of a below-average Atlantic season, and the stated reason was exactly what killed Bertha: El Niño-driven wind shear. When the seasonal forecasters said below average, this is what they meant in practice. A basin where the water is warm enough, the waves come off Africa on schedule, all the local ingredients sit on the counter, and yet nothing bakes, because 40 knots of hostile wind at jet stream level stands over the kitchen, breaking every storm that tries to rise. That is the corpse on the table. Cause of death. Not cold water, not a lack of seed disturbances, not bad luck. Cause of death. An atmosphere reorganized from 10,000 miles away. Because while all of this was failing to happen in the Atlantic, the other side of the planet was setting records. And I do mean records. Plural, historic, and in one case, a record involving the United States that almost nobody on the mainland seems to know occurred. Part 3. The Category 5 Factory. The West Pacific's 2026 season announced itself early, and it announced itself at the very top of the scale. In April, months before the traditional heart of typhoon season, Super Typhoon Sinlaku reached Category 5 intensity and tore through the Mariana Islands region. 17 people died. The damage bill reached $1.5 billion. For the Marianas, United States territory, home to American citizens, American military bases, American schools, it was a catastrophe arriving absurdly early in the calendar, the kind of out-of-season violence that makes forecasters start checking the ocean heat maps for what else is loaded. A Category 5 in April is not just early, it is a statement about the state of the ocean. Typhoon seasons build toward late summer for a reason. That is when the upper ocean has spent months absorbing sunlight and the heat reservoir is deepest. For the West Pacific to support top-of-scale intensity in April, the reservoir had to be full before the filling season even began, which in the spring of 2026 it was. The tropical Pacific was already running its record warm El Niño transition, the warm pool already deeper than the date said it had any right to be. Sinlaku was the first invoice from that surplus. It would not be the last. They did not have to wait long for the answer. In early July, a storm named Bavi began organizing east of Guam over some of the deepest, warmest water on the planet. The West Pacific Warm Pool is the largest reservoir of very warm ocean water on Earth, the one place where the 26 degrees Celsius water that fuels tropical cyclones extends not meters, but hundreds of feet down. Storms that form on its eastern edge get something Atlantic storms almost never get: a runway. Days of open, superheated ocean between berth and the first landmass, with nothing to interrupt the intensification process. Bavi used every mile of it. We covered Bavi on this channel in our video from July 3rd, while it was still intensifying toward the islands. At the time, the forecast called for something near 150 knots with gusts approaching 200, seas of 45 feet, and typhoon watches flying across Guam, Rota, Tinian and Saipan. Even those numbers felt outrageous. Bavi exceeded them. On July 4th, Bavi crossed the threshold into Category 5, and on the night of July 5th into July 6th, at peak intensity, Super Typhoon Bavi reached maximum sustained winds of 180 miles per hour, and drove its eye directly across the island of Rota in the United States Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands. Let me put that event in its proper historical frame, because it deserves it. Rota is American soil, and the eye of a Category 5 tropical cyclone passing directly over American soil is an event that, according to the reliable historical record, had happened only 5 times before. Ever. Bavi made it 6. In the entire recorded history of American hurricanes and typhoons, Camille, Andrew, Michael, the Labor Day hurricane of 1935, U2 in 2018, this set of Category 5 eyes that have actually crossed United States land is small enough to count on your fingers. This July, over a quiet weekend when most of the mainland was watching fireworks recaps and heat advisories, the Pacific quietly added one more to that list, with winds 23 miles per hour above the Category 5 threshold. Try to hold 180 miles per hour in your head as a physical experience rather than a number. It is the wind speed of a violent tornado, the kind that planes a neighborhood down to its foundations, except a tornado delivers it for seconds, and a super typhoon's eyewall delivers it for hours, over an area wider than the island it is crossing. At that speed, rain does not fall. It travels horizontally and strips paint. Concrete power poles snap. The ocean around the eyewall is no longer recognizable as ocean. The boundary between sea and air becomes a churned layer of foam and spray. That is what crossed Rota in the dark, early on July 6th. The island's residents, along with Guam's, had spent the preceding days in a ritual American citizens on the mainland rarely think about. Typhoon condition, readiness levels counting down, shelters opening, military bases securing aircraft. The 4th time in a decade the Marianas have had to brace for a storm near the top of the scale. And the deeper unease is that this was the 2nd time this year the same community faced the same nightmare. Sinlaku in April, Bavi in July. 2 Category 5 events threatening the same small American islands within 90 days, in a basin where the traditional peak of typhoon season has not even arrived. August, September and October are climatologically the West Pacific's most active months. Everything you have just heard happened during the warm-up. After leaving the Marianas, Bavi kept going, churning northwest through the Philippine Sea, brushing toward Taiwan and Japan's Ryukyu Islands, a multi-thousand-mile track of sustained violence. And in the season's ledger, Bavi slotted in as the 9th named storm, the 3rd typhoon, and the 2nd super typhoon of the West Pacific year, by the first week of July. Step back and look at those season totals side by side, because the asymmetry is almost comical. By late July, the Atlantic, 2 named storms, 0 hurricanes, strongest winds all season roughly 45 miles per hour. The West Pacific over the same span, 9 named storms, multiple typhoons, 2 Category 5 super typhoons, including storms at 180 miles per hour, with $1.5 billion in damage, 17 dead, and an American island that took a direct Category 5 ice strike. And the Marianas repeat exposure as its own grim pattern. Guam and the northern Marianas sit on the western edge of that deep, warm pool, in the corridor where El Niño years push storm formation east, which means storms reach them at or near peak intensity, with the full runway behind them. The island's history reads like a catalogue of the scale's upper end. Karen in 1962, Pongsona in 2002, U2 in 2018, and now Sinlaku and Bavi in a single season. There is no inland to evacuate to on an island 14 miles long. You harden, you shelter, and you take what the ocean sends. This year the ocean has sent the worst it makes twice. There is a reason the Marianas keep drawing these storms, and it is the same reason 2026's violence is concentrated in the Pacific at all, though we will open that machine fully in a few minutes. For now, just hold the pattern. In the years when the equatorial Pacific runs hot, the zone where typhoons are born and where they do their earliest and fastest strengthening slides east, directly onto the longitude of Guam and its neighbours. The islands stop being a waypoint on the storm's road west and become the place the road begins. Sinlaku in April and Bavi in July are not two unlucky coincidences at the same address. They are 2 hits from a machine that this year is pointed at that address. And the timing of the first one carries its own warning. A Category 5 in April is close to a contradiction in terms. Typhoon intensity is governed by how much heat the upper ocean has banked, and that reservoir normally fills through the summer, which is exactly why the basin's monsters overwhelmingly arrive in autumn. For the ocean to support a top-of-scale storm in April, the reservoir had to be near full before the filling season even started. The heat loaded months early by the same El Niño transition the buoys were measuring on the equator. Sinlaku was not only a disaster for the Marianas, it was a gauge reading. It told forecasters, in the plainest possible terms, that the Pacific had a full tank before summer had even begun. Line the global scoreboard up, and the asymmetry becomes total. 3 storms on Earth reached Category 5 in 2026 through late July. Horatio in the southern Indian Ocean in February, then Sinlaku, then Bavi. Every one of them formed in an ocean warmed and organised by the same El Niño. Not one formed in the Atlantic, which has not managed a Category 5 or a Category 4 or a Category 1 or a hurricane of any kind at all. The planet's most violent storm class has been produced 3 times this year, and the Atlantic has been shut out of it entirely in the same months it would normally be starting to compete. Pacific and Indian Oceans 3, Atlantic nothing, and the machine responsible has not finished its work, and the Pacific's productivity was not confined to the western side of the basin. Globally, 2026 has now produced 3 Category 5 tropical cyclones. Tropical Cyclone Horatio, which spun up over the southern Indian Ocean back in February, while the northern hemisphere was still in winter, then Sinlaku, then Bavi. Every single one of them formed in an ocean that is not the Atlantic. The scoreboard for the most violent storm category on Earth this year reads Pacific and Indian Oceans 3, Atlantic nothing, not a Category 5, not a Category 1, not anything. Run the pace comparison one more way. The West Pacific reached 9 named storms in the first week of July. The Atlantic reached 2 by the last week of July and needed a season and a half's worth of luck to get those. If the 2 basins were factories, one would be running triple shifts and the other would have a padlock on the gate, and the same corporate headquarters is issuing both sets of orders. One basin cannot start a storm, the other is running an assembly line for the strongest storms this planet makes, and if you want to know whether that assembly line is still running, whether Sinlaku and Bavi were flukes of the early season, or products of a machine still very much switched on, you do not have to look at history at all. You just have to look at the Philippine Sea today. Part 4. The storm being built right now. At this very moment, as this video goes out, the West Pacific is assembling its next storm, and you can watch the machine work in real time. Tropical Storm Noel, designated 11W by the Joint Typhoon Warning Center and known as Quiapo in the Philippines, which runs its own naming system, spun up on July 24th in the Philippine Sea at 18.3 north, 125.1 east. Its birth statistics were modest: sustained winds of 35 knots, about 40 miles per hour, moving west-northwest at 15 knots. On paper, at this instant, Nool is no stronger than Bertha ever was. But the resemblance ends there, because everything around this storm is different. Start with the water. Nool is traversing sea surface temperatures of 30 to 31 degrees Celsius, 86 to 88 degrees Fahrenheit, and critically that warmth is not a thin surface film. The ocean heat content along its path is high, meaning the warm layer runs deep. When a storm churns up the sea beneath it, cold water from below normally rises and chokes off the fuel supply. Here the storm digs down and finds more warm water. It is the difference between a match burning a sheet of paper and a match dropped into a fuel depot. Then there is the atmosphere. Where Bertha fought 40 knots of hostile shear, Nool is organising under a favourable pattern: deep moisture, supportive outflow, and steering from a subtropical ridge parked south of Japan that will sling it west-northwest along the ridge's southwestern edge. The Joint Typhoon Warning Centre's language is unambiguous: a highly dynamic and rapidly organising wind field, with near-rapid intensification expected in the first 12 hours, and both the storm force and typhoon force wind fields forecast to expand outward rapidly as it approaches peak. Rapid intensification deserves its own definition, because it is the phrase this whole season keeps orbiting. Officially, it means a storm's maximum winds jumping at least 30 knots, about 35 miles per hour as within 24 hours. It is the single hardest thing in tropical meteorology to forecast, and the most dangerous, because it compresses the warning timeline for everyone in the path. A population that went to bed preparing for a tropical storm can wake up facing a major typhoon. The ingredients are known: deep warm water, low shear, moist air, an efficient outflow channel venting the storm's exhaust aloft. And Nool is checking those boxes one by one. What cannot be known in advance is how hard the ocean presses the accelerator once the process starts. That has been the recurring lesson of this Pacific year. The ingredients keep supporting more than the forecasts dare to write down. The forecast script runs like this. Over the next day, Nool brushes the rugged terrain of northern Luzon, which will temporarily disrupt its core. Mountains are the one obstacle in its way. This is not an abstraction for the Philippines. The storm carries a local name there, Quiapo, and as it passes it will drag the southwest monsoon across the country behind it, enhancing rains far from its centre, a reminder that in this part of the world the storm's edges are a hazard of their own. The Philippine Weather Service tracked it through the morning of July 24th, moving at a brisk clip, about 530 kilometres southeast of Taiwan's southern tip. Taiwan's weather agency, watching the same track, has already issued a sea warning as the storm passes to its south, and had been publicly weighing that decision for 2 days before the storm even had a name, which tells you how confident the models were about this system before it existed. Then, on the far side, comes the part of the forecast with the ominous phrasing, a significant intensification surge over the South China Sea as the storm pulls away from land, rounds the western edge of the ridge, and turns poleward toward the coast of southern China. Official guidance peaks Nool at 80 knots, roughly 90 miles per hour, a strong typhoon, at landfall in Guangdong province within about 48 hours, driving significant wave heights up to 8.5 metres, 28 feet of ocean. And the track guidance is tightly clustered on a genuinely uncomfortable target. The GFS model brings the storm's core within 25 nautical miles of Hong Kong. The European model runs about 100 nautical miles further east. Either way, this storm is headed into the Pearl River Delta region. Hong Kong, Shenzhen, Guangzhou, Macau, a continuous urban corridor holding tens of millions of people, one of the densest concentrations of humanity and economic value on the planet, within 2 days. 28-foot seas deserve a moment of translation too. That is the height of a 3-story building, arriving as open ocean swell against a coastline lined with container ports, ferry routes, and some of the busiest shipping lanes on Earth. Even a storm that never exceeds its 80-knot forecast turns that stretch of the South China Sea into a place no vessel wants to be, and drives a storm surge into estuaries that have flooded catastrophically in far weaker systems. The difference between the official forecast and the unofficial ceiling is not academic for this coastline. It is the difference between a bad 2 days and a regional disaster. And it is worth being specific about what sits under that track because the forecast is pointing at a particular place. The Pearl River Delta is, by many measures, the largest continuous urban region on Earth, a merged megalopolis of something like 70 to 80 million people, where Hong Kong, Shenzhen, Guangzhou, Dongguan, Foshan and Macau have grown into one another around the mouth of a single river. It is one of the planet's central manufacturing and shipping hubs. A meaningful share of the world's electronics moves through its ports. And it sits at the head of a funnel, a broad estuary that channels anything driven up it from the south against some of the most densely built coastline anywhere. A storm does not have to reach the unofficial ceiling to be dangerous here. It only has to arrive. Japan's meteorological agency, which issues the region's official numbering, was already moving Nul up its intensity scale on the day it formed, lifting it toward severe tropical storm status and projecting further strengthening once it clears Luzon. The mainland Chinese forecast placed landfall along the southern coast, somewhere between Zhuhai, on the delta's western edge, and the Fujian coast to the northeast, in the window between Saturday night and Sunday morning. Inside the first 48 hours this video is online. Rainfall guidance for eastern Guangdong and southern Fujian ran past 20 inches in the heaviest bands, the sort of totals that flood cities regardless of the wind number on the label. Hold on to the lesson of Bertha. Half a world away and a full category weaker. It was the water, not the wind, that put a Texas river into major flood. Rain does not check the category first, and there is an instrument you can watch this resolve on, in real time, if you choose to. Hong Kong runs one of the oldest and most refined tropical cyclone warning systems in the world, a numbered signal scale that climbs from 1 to 10 as a storm bears down, each step triggering a defined set of closures and precautions across the territory. When that signal starts to rise this weekend, you're watching one of the most storm-experienced cities on the planet read the same ocean the forecasters are reading and commit to it, hour by hour. That number, more than any forecast discussion, is the honest gauge of how seriously the Delta is taking what the Pacific assembled this week. Now, a note of honesty, because this channel deals in what the data actually says. 80 knots is the official forecast ceiling, but there is louder chatter among storm trackers arguing that the ceiling is conservative, that given the extreme ocean heat waiting in the South China Sea, Nul's true potential runs to Category 4 or beyond if its core comes off Luzon intact. That is speculation, not forecast, and I want to label it clearly as such. The official number is 80 knots, but it is worth saying plainly why that speculation exists. Twice already this season, in this exact basin, over this same anomalously hot ocean, storms have outrun their intensity forecasts. Sinlaku did it in April. Bavi did it 3 weeks ago, blowing past a 150-knot forecast on its way to 180 miles per hour. When the same ocean serves up the same conditions a third time, forecasters watch their own upper bounds nervously. Within 48 hours of this video going live, we will know which number the ocean chose. Here is what to watch over the next 2 days, because this storm will resolve itself on almost exactly the timeline of this video's first weekend online. Watch the Joint Typhoon Warning Center's fixes for how much of Nul's core survives the brush with Luzon. A clean core exiting into the South China Sea is the trigger condition for the surge scenario. Watch whether Taiwan's sea warning escalates. Watch the Hong Kong Observatory's signals as the core closes within its warning radius. That agency's escalating typhoon signal system will tell you, hour by hour, how seriously the Delta is taking the approach. And watch the water itself. The South China Sea in late July of an El Niño onset year is about as hot as that body of water ever gets. Every forecaster watching this storm knows both numbers, the 80-knot forecast and what the ocean underneath it could theoretically support. The gap between those two numbers is where the next 2 days live. So this is where the planet stands tonight, in the Atlantic, a 7-day forecast of nothing, stretching toward 15. In the Pacific, a storm born this morning forecast to strike a megacity coastline within 2 days over water hot enough that the official forecast comes with an unofficial asterisk. One engine did both. That is the claim on the table, which brings us to the question this entire video turns on. What kind of force reaches across an entire planet and does both of these things at once? Sets one ocean's ceiling at 45 miles per hour while feeding another ocean's storms to 180. What decides, on a hemispheric scale, where the atmosphere permits violence and where it forbids it? The answer lives in a strip of ocean most people could not find on a map, where the trade winds faltered this spring, and where a feedback loop first described half a century ago is now running away with the global climate. It is time to open up the machine. Part 5. The engine under the Pacific. To understand the machine that is running both oceans, you have to start with a version of the Pacific that no longer exists, the normal one. In a neutral year, the tropical Pacific operates like a planetary scale conveyor. Steady trade winds blow from east to west along the equator day after day, and as they blow, they physically push the sun-warmed surface water ahead of them. Over centuries, this endless westward sweep has piled the warmest water on Earth into a mound against Asia and Australia. The West Pacific Warm Pool, a body of 30-degree water so deep and vast that oceanographers treat it as a permanent feature of the planet, like a mountain range made of heat. On the eastern side, off South America, the departing surface water has to be replaced, and it gets replaced from below. Cold, nutrient-rich water wells up from the deep ocean along the coast of Peru and Ecuador. So the normal Pacific is lopsided by design, hot and deep in the west, cool and upwelling in the east, and the atmosphere organizes itself around that asymmetry. Moist air rises over the hot western pool in perpetual thunderstorms, flows eastward at high altitude, sinks over the cool eastern water, and returns westward at the surface as the trade winds. That closed loop of rising and sinking air has a name, the Walker circulation, after Sir Gilbert Walker, the British scientist who first found its pressure signature in the 1920s, while trying to understand why India's monsoon sometimes failed. Now here is the vulnerability. The whole arrangement is a feedback loop holding itself together. The trades pile the warm water west. The warm water in the west drives the rising air. The rising air drives the circulation that maintains the trades. In 1969, the meteorologist Jacob Bjerknes realized the loop could also run in reverse. If the trade winds falter, even briefly, even from something as small as a string of storm bursts along the equator, the warm water they were holding in place begins to slosh back eastward. As it spreads east, the rising air follows it, which weakens the trades further, which releases more warm water, which pulls the thunderstorms further east still. The feedback that maintained the normal Pacific starts dismantling it instead. The cold upwelling off South America shuts down. The eastern and central Pacific, normally the cool side of the seesaw, becomes a vast shield of anomalously hot water, venting heat and moisture into the atmosphere in places that are usually dry and stable. That runaway state is El Niño. It is not an invader or an anomaly imposed from outside. It is the Pacific's own circulatory system running backwards. It is worth remembering what put Gilbert Walker on this trail in the first place, because the origin story is also a warning label. Walker was not studying the Pacific for its own sake. He was the head of the Indian Weather Service in the years after the catastrophic monsoon failures of the late 1800s, including the failure of 1877, which triggered famines across India, China, and Brazil that killed tens of millions of people. We told that story in full in our drought video earlier this month. Walker suspected the monsoon's failures were connected to something planetary, and he spent decades combing pressure records from Darwin to Tahiti until he found it. A seesaw in atmospheric pressure across the entire Pacific, rocking back and forth over years. He called it the Southern Oscillation. He was documenting El Niño's atmospheric half a century before anyone understood the ocean's role, and the reason he found it at all is that its swings were already, in the 19th century, capable of killing more people than most wars. This phenomenon earned its scientific pedigree through body counts. Today, we watch the machine with instruments Walker could not have imagined. A lattice of moored buoys stretches across the equatorial Pacific, measuring temperature not just at the surface, but down through the upper ocean, radioing the profile home by satellite. Altimetry satellites read the literal bulge of warm water. Warm water stands taller by centimeters, and the radar can see it as it migrates east. Which is how forecasters watched this particular event coming in a way no generation before could, as a subsurface wave of heat, called a Kelvin wave, rolling eastward beneath the surface through late winter and spring, weeks before the surface temperatures responded. The basement flooded first, on camera, in the data. And in 2026, the reversal came on with unusual violence. Walk the official index one more time because the trajectory is the story. Minus 0.54 in the November through January reading, minus 0.37, minus 0.14, then across the line, plus 0.13, plus 0.51, plus 0.98. Underneath the index, the absolute surface temperature of the central equatorial Pacific climbed nearly 3 degrees Celsius, from just under 26 to 28.7. And remember that these are 3-month averages over a stretch of ocean thousands of miles long. Warming a patch of your local lake by 3 degrees takes a heat wave. Warming a quarter of the equatorial Pacific by 3 degrees requires moving an amount of energy that is genuinely difficult to write down in sensible units. The ocean equivalent of continental drift happening on a stopwatch. Where did that heat come from? It did not appear from nowhere. It was already in the ocean, stored below the surface in the western warm pool, loaded there by years of trade winds, and carried east along the thermocline in slow subsurface waves once the winds began to fail. This is why forecasters watching the subsurface data in early spring grew alarmed before the surface numbers looked like much. The heat was already in transit below the waterline, a flood arriving through the basement. By the time the surface readings crossed the El Niño threshold in late spring, the declarations were nearly a formality. The World Meteorological Organization made its call at the start of June. NOAA followed within days. Both were, in a sense, announcing something the ocean had committed to months earlier. And yet, for all that instrumentation, the spring of 2026 still managed to humble the forecast system because of a known blind spot with its own name, the spring predictability barrier. For reasons buried in the physics of the coupled ocean and atmosphere, model forecasts of El Niño made in early spring are the least reliable of the year. The system is at its most delicately balanced, and small errors grow fastest. Models looking across that barrier last winter disagreed sharply about whether 2026 would produce an El Niño at all. The ocean answered by producing one of the fastest La Niña to El Niño transitions in the record. This matters for how you should hear every number in the rest of this video. The official forecasts for this event's eventual peak are genuinely uncertain, and the recent bias of this particular event has been to outrun them. The storms have been outrunning their forecasts. The index has been outrunning its forecasts. The pattern of 2026, in one sentence, is that the Pacific keeps arriving early. There is one more number that belongs in this part of the story, because everything that follows scales from it. El Niño events are ranked by the peak of that index. Cross plus 0.5 and it is an official event. Cross plus 1.5 and it is strong. Cross plus 2.0 and you enter the category forecasters informally call a super El Niño, a class that has occurred only 3 times in the modern satellite record: 1982 into 83, 1997 into 98, and 2015 into 16. Each of those 3 reshaped weather on every inhabited continent. As of this week, the 2026 event sits at plus 0.98 and climbing in July, with its climatological peak still 4 to 6 months away. El Niño events almost always peak in the Northern Hemisphere winter, which means the engine you're watching disassemble the Atlantic hurricane season and supercharge the Pacific right now is, by its own schedule, still warming up. One last piece of scale before we open the 2 dials. The reason an El Niño's peak matters to everyone, not just coastal residents, is that the phenomenon is, at bottom, the ocean handing stored heat to the atmosphere. The tropical Pacific is the planet's largest solar collector, and during La Niña years it banks energy below the surface. During El Niño, it makes a withdrawal, venting years of banked heat into the air over a few seasons. That is why the hottest years in the global record cluster immediately after strong El Niño peaks. The ocean pays out, and the whole atmosphere runs a fever for a year or 2 afterward. An event peaking this winter would be expected to push 2027 toward uncharted global temperatures, on top of a baseline that is already, as we covered 2 weeks ago, the hottest ever measured. The storms are the sharp edge of this story. They are not the whole story. Hold that thought. Because now we can finally answer the question from the end of the last part. How does a warm patch of equatorial water, thousands of miles from both the Gulf and the South China Sea, reach out and decide the fate of storms in each? Part 6. The Kill Switch. Start with the Atlantic, because the Atlantic story is the cleaner kill. When El Niño drags the Pacific's rising air eastward, it does not just rearrange the Pacific, it moves the single largest heat release zone on the planet. The perpetual thunderstorm complex over the warm pool, the fire under the atmosphere's boiler, slides thousands of miles east of its normal position, and the atmosphere, being a connected fluid, has to reorganize around the new fire location globally. The Walker circulation cells shift and buckle all the way around the equator. Air that used to rise over Indonesia sinks instead. Air that used to sink over the eastern Pacific rises. And critically for our story, the outflow from all that displaced tropical heating pumps momentum into the subtropical jet stream, the river of fast, high-altitude wind that flows across the southern United States and out over the Atlantic. In an El Niño summer, that jet runs stronger and further south than normal, which parks a persistent current of fast westerly wind at 35 to 40,000 feet directly on top of the main development region, the Atlantic's hurricane nursery, and the Caribbean. Forecasters put a number on this hostility. The standard measure of vertical wind shear compares the wind near the top of the storm's tower, around 40,000 feet, with the wind near the ocean surface. Below roughly 20 knots of difference, a tropical cyclone can organize and strengthen. Between 20 and 30, it struggles. Above 30, development is close to impossible, and sustained values above 40 are a death sentence for anything already formed. In El Niño summers, long stretches of the Caribbean and the tropical Atlantic run persistently in those upper ranges for weeks at a time. The Caribbean in particular earns a grim nickname in years like this, the graveyard. Storms that survive the crossing from Africa arrive at the graveyard's eastern gate and simply come apart, one after another, in the same stretch of water where in other years they explode into majors. Go back to the chimney. A developing tropical storm in that environment is trying to stand a 40,000-foot tower of thunderstorms upright, while the top 30% of the atmosphere moves 40 or 50 knots faster than the bottom. It cannot. The tower shears over. The heat vents sideways. Dry air floods the tilted core, and the disturbance dies, usually quietly, as an unremarkable cluster of storms that never gets a name, never makes a graphic, never appears in a headline. That is the mechanism by which an entire hurricane season can be strangled without a single dramatic event. There is no wall of cold water, no visible barrier, just an invisible river of wind 5 miles up, executing every candidate storm in its cradle. This is not theory awaiting confirmation. It is one of the most repeatable relationships in all of seasonal forecasting, and it is the reason seasonal hurricane forecasting works at all. Run down the El Niño years of the modern record and watch the Atlantic flinch every single time. 1972, El Niño year, and one of the least active Atlantic seasons of its era. 1982, as the first measured Super El Niño spun up, a feeble Atlantic. 1997, hold that one, it gets its own act. 2015, during the most recent super event, a below-average Atlantic season in which the Caribbean recorded some of the most hostile wind shear ever measured there, while storm after storm withered on approach. The correlation is strong enough that when NOAA's seasonal forecasters issued their 55% below-average call for 2026, they were not gazing into anything mysterious. They were reading the oldest and most reliable page in their own playbook. When the equatorial Pacific runs hot, the Atlantic runs scared. This is worth dwelling on for a second, because it is the quiet reason seasonal hurricane forecasting exists as a science at all. You cannot forecast an individual hurricane months out. The atmosphere is too chaotic. The specific disturbance that becomes a storm has not even formed yet. But you can forecast the environment, and the single most powerful lever on that environment, the one variable that lets a forecaster in the spring say something useful about the whole summer ahead, is the state of the equatorial Pacific. Once the ocean commits to an El Niño, the shear response over the Atlantic is so consistent, so physically traceable through the Walker circulation, that the seasonal outlook practically writes itself. The forecasters do not need to know where any storm will form. They only need to know that a river of hostile wind will be waiting over the nursery when the storms try. That is why NOAA could tilt the odds toward a quiet Atlantic back in the spring, before a single storm had formed. They were not predicting the weather. They were reading the thermostat on the equator and following the wire that runs from it to the Atlantic. The wire has never once failed to carry the signal, and shear is only the primary weapon. El Niño's reorganization also enhances sinking air across much of the tropical Atlantic, and sinking air is dry, stable air, the opposite of what a storm needs. The trade inversion strengthens. The atmosphere becomes resistant to the deep thunderstorm towers that seed cyclones in the first place. So the candidate storms that the shear does not decapitate are often stillborn before they even organize, smothered under a lid of warm, dry descending air. Here is what makes the 2026 Atlantic genuinely eerie, though, And you should sit with this. The water is still warm. This is not a cold Atlantic. The basin has spent recent years setting sea surface temperature records, and the fuel that powered the hyperactive seasons of the past decade has not gone anywhere. If you could switch off the shear tomorrow, lift the jet, relax the sinking air, the Atlantic would come roaring back within weeks. The season is not dead because the ocean is exhausted. It is dead because the atmosphere overhead has been weaponized against it, from 10,000 miles away, by a heat source in the wrong ocean. Picture the season the shear is currently cancelling because the counterfactual sharpens the point. Somewhere in the eastern Atlantic this week, an easterly wave rolled off Africa that, in a neutral year, might have been this season's first Cape Verde hurricane, might have spent 10 days crossing warm open water, might have arrived off the islands or the Carolinas in mid-August as a name people would remember. Instead, it will live and die as a nameless cluster of thunderstorms, decapitated somewhere south of the Azores, mourned by no one because no one ever knew what it might have become. That is what the National Hurricane Centre's clean outlook actually describes, not an ocean with nothing in it, but an ocean where everything that tries is quietly killed. The waves keep coming, the shear keeps executing, and the water underneath keeps warming in the summer sun, unspent. That distinction, suppressed versus depleted, is the most important idea in this entire video, and it is the one that history is going to underline in red when we get to 1998. An Atlantic hurricane season under El Niño shear is not a fire that has gone out. It is a fire that has been denied oxygen while someone keeps stacking wood on it. Every month of quiet is another month the basin's heat goes unspent, another month of fuel accumulating on a warming pile. The National Hurricane Centre's one-sentence outlook, formation not expected, describes the next 7 days. It says nothing at all about the size of the account balance building behind the shear. Nobody should read a silent Atlantic as a safe Atlantic. The correct reading is stranger and less comfortable. The silence is the sound of interest accruing. One caution, so the mechanism does not get overstated. A shear suppressed season is not the same thing as a season that cannot hurt anyone, and it is not the only way an Atlantic season goes quiet. Basins have collapsed before from dry, stable air or cool water. Quiet seasons with mundane causes. What distinguishes an El Niño suppression, and what makes 2026 diagnostic rather than merely dull, is the signature combination: record warm water underneath, a functioning wave train upstream, and a forecastable, physically traceable hostile wind field imposed from outside the basin. Everything about this quiet is imported, and imported conditions have an expiration date. They last exactly as long as the exporter keeps shipping. The Pacific engine will not run hot forever. When it stops, the Atlantic's atmosphere reverts, and what is left behind is the one ingredient that never went away. The warmest fuel supply in the basin's recorded history, untouched. Meanwhile, the same reorganization that executes Atlantic storms is doing precisely the opposite on the other side of the dateline. The kill switch and the throttle are the same lever, pushed in opposite directions. Let us cross the Pacific and watch the throttle work. Part 7. The Throttle. Everything El Niño takes from the Atlantic it hands to the Pacific, and it makes the delivery in 3 distinct ways. The first gift is geography. In a normal year, West Pacific typhoons tend to form relatively close to Asia, on the western flank of the warm pool, and their window for strengthening before landfall is comparatively short. When El Niño pulls the warm water and the rising, stormy air eastward along the equator, the entire typhoon nursery migrates east and southeast with it. Storms are born further from the coastline, out toward the Marianas and beyond, which means every storm inherits a longer runway, additional days over open, superheated ocean before it encounters land. Intensification takes time. A storm born 2,000 miles from the coast can spend that time climbing categories. This is the single most reliable El Niño signature in the typhoon record. Not necessarily more storms, but stronger ones, longer-lived ones, storms that have the room to reach their ceiling. It is also why the Marianas, normally a waypoint on the storm's way west, become a bullseye in El Niño years. The islands sit exactly where the relocated nursery does its early violent growth. Usk rota. The second gift is fuel concentration. The same eastward slosh that starves the coast of Peru of upwelling spreads the warm layer across a broader swathe of the central Pacific, and in 2026 that swathe is stacked on top of the warmest baseline ocean ever measured. The 30 to 31 degree surface readings under Newell are the visible skin of it, but the decisive variable is depth, the ocean heat content that determines whether a storm zone churning shuts it down or feeds it. Recall the mechanism from Bearvy's rapid intensification, which we walked through in detail in the July 3rd video. A storm over thin warmth stirs up its own cold bath water and stalls, while a storm over deep warmth digs and finds only more fuel. El Niño deepens the fuel across exactly the corridor where the relocated nursery sends its storms. The result is a basin where rapid intensification stops being the exception and starts being the default expectation, where forecasters write 80 knots in the official product and privately watch for 120. It is worth being precise about what deep fuel actually means, because it is the hinge of the whole intensification story. The variable that matters most is not the surface temperature at all, it is how far down the warmth goes. Forecasters track the depth of the 26 degrees Celsius layer, the coolest water that can still sustain a hurricane, and they fold it into a single figure called tropical cyclone heat potential, the total reservoir of usable heat stacked beneath a patch of ocean. A storm sitting over a thin warm skin churns cold water up from just below within hours and chokes on it. A storm sitting over a deep warm column can churn all it likes and keep finding fuel because the cold water is too far down to reach. That depth is precisely what El Niño builds across the relocated nursery. It does not merely warm the surface, it thickens the warm layer, pushing the 26-degree line deeper along the corridor where the season's storms are born. When you hear that Newell is crossing high ocean heat content, that is the specific thing being described. Not a hot bath, but a hot bath with no cold bottom to stir up. It is the single clearest reason this season keeps building storms that outrun their own intensity forecasts. There is a measurement designed to capture exactly this effect, and you will need it for the next act, so let me introduce it properly. It is called Accumulated Cyclone Energy. ACE, for short. Instead of counting storms, which treats a 2-day tropical storm and a 2-week super typhoon as equal entries, ACE adds up the square of every storm's wind speed at every measurement point through its entire life. A week short-lived storm barely registers. A powerful storm that lives for 2 weeks over open ocean piles up an enormous score, which makes ACE the perfect fingerprint detector for El Niño typhoon seasons. The longer runways and deeper fuel do not necessarily produce more storms, but they reliably produce storms that live longer and run harder, and ACE is precisely the accounting system that notices. In an El Niño year, the West Pacific's ACE does not just rise. Historically, it explodes. Keep that in your pocket. The relocated runway also changes where storms end up, not just how strong they get. El Niño-era typhoons, born further east, are more likely to recurve, to sweep poleward and clip Japan, Korea, and the open northwest Pacific, rather than driving straight into the Philippines or southern China on a short westward track. Recurving storms spend even more of their lives over open water, which feeds the ACE ledger further, and they menace a different set of coastlines than the ones the climatology books emphasize. Though as Newell demonstrates tonight, the westward door does not close. Storms that form on the nursery's western edge still take the short track, and they take it across water the El Niño has made hotter than usual. The relocated pattern does not spare southern China. It sends fewer storms there, and makes the ones it sends better fed. The third gift is permission. Shear does not simply vanish from the planet in an El Niño year. It relocates, following the reorganized circulation. The hostile upper winds that stand over the Atlantic have their mirror image in a western central Pacific, where the upper atmosphere runs unusually quiet, and the outflow channels open wide. The same global reorganization, read from the other side. One basin's execution order is the other basin's building permit, and bear in mind what the calendar still holds. Everything the West Pacific has done this year, it has done before its own climatological peak. August, September and October are the months when the basin normally does its worst, when the monsoon trough is broadest, the ocean warmest, the storm production line running at full rate even in ordinary years. Now overlay the El Niño gifts on that peak, the relocated nursery, the deepened fuel, the opened permission field, all coinciding with the season's natural maximum, while the index itself keeps climbing toward whatever this event's summit turns out to be. The early season gave us Sinlaku and Bavi as previews under partial throttle. The autumn will run the same machine at full throttle at peak season over the same superheated ocean. That is not a forecast of any specific storm. It is an observation about the settings on the machine. Add the three gifts together and you get the season we are watching. A Category 5 in April, a 180 mile/hour eye over American soil in July, 9 named storms before the traditional season peak, and a brand new storm spinning up over bathtub water with an intensity forecast that its own forecasters describe in the careful language of people who suspect they are lowballing. None of this is the Pacific misbehaving. This is the Pacific doing exactly what the displaced engine tells it to do. The same engine, remember, that is holding the Atlantic underwater. Every one of Bavi's 180 miles per hour and every knot Bertha never achieved trace back to the same strip of equatorial ocean where the trade winds faltered last spring. If you want to watch the throttle operate in miniature, you will get your chance this weekend, because Noel's 48 hours are a compressed demonstration of the entire mechanism. Deep fuel, the 30-degree South China Sea, preheated by the El Niño transition. Permission, the quiet upper pattern and open outflow that the reorganized circulation grants this side of the planet. The only variable withheld is runway. Luzon interrupts the track early, which is why the official forecast stops at 80 knots rather than 140. Every forecaster's private question about this storm is simply whether fuel and permission can overcome the shortage of runway. That is the throttle, isolated on a 2-day timer, pointed at a delta holding tens of millions of people. And that machine-level view raises the question that the rest of this video has to answer. If one El Niño can do this in its opening months, if this is the split at plus 0.98 in July, with the event's peak still half a year away, what does the full version look like? What happens when the index crosses 1.5 or 2.0? What does a completed year of this pattern do to the planet? We do not have to guess. The completed version of this exact experiment ran once before, within living memory, and it was measured from beginning to end. The year was 1997. The Pacific built the most violent typhoon season ever recorded. The Atlantic fell so silent that an entire month went by without a single storm for the first time in a generation. And then, 14 months later, the bill arrived, in the mountains of Central America, in the middle of the night, in the rain. Part 8, 1997, the year of the super typhoon. In the spring of 1997, the trade winds over the equatorial Pacific collapsed, and the warm pool began its eastward slide. The same reversal you watched happen this spring, running on the same physics, measured by the ancestors of the same boys. By summer, the index was climbing at a pace that stunned the researchers watching it. By its peak the following winter, it would reach roughly plus 2.4 degrees Celsius, at the time the strongest El Niño ever directly measured, an event so far beyond precedent that scientists took to calling it, simply, the El Niño of the century. And the West Pacific answered with the most violent typhoon season in recorded history. The statistics from that season read like typographical errors. 11 super typhoons formed in the West Pacific in 1997, 11 storms reaching the basin's highest classification in a single year, tying a record that had stood since 1965. 10 tropical cyclones reached Category 5 equivalent intensity, the most ever recorded in a single season in any basin on Earth, a record that still stands today. And the season's accumulated cyclone energy, the metric I handed you in the last part, the one that measures not how many storms form but how long and how hard they run, reached 570.4. That is the highest ACE ever recorded in any tropical cyclone basin in any year, before or since. For scale, a busy Atlantic season might post an ACE around 150 and be remembered for decades. The 1997 West Pacific nearly quadrupled that. Take a moment with that ACE figure, because it is the single most important number in this act. 570.4 is not a record the way a race time is a record, edged out by fractions. It is a record the way a flood crest is a record, a value so far above the rest of the distribution that researchers still use the 1997 West Pacific as the definitional case study of what El Niño does to a typhoon season. When scientists want to explain the relocated nursery, the longer runways, the intensity tilt, they reach for 1997 the way physicists reach for the perfect experiment. An entire basin for an entire year, running at the theoretical limit of what the mechanism allows, and the mechanism was the same one running now, Genesis displaced east and southeast toward the dateline, storms spending week after week over open superheated water, the intensity distribution shoved toward the top of the scale. The displacement showed up exactly where theory said it should. Storms in 1997 kept forming in places the climatology book said were marginal. Far to the east, out toward and beyond the dateline, in the corridor where the relocated warm water and the eastward extended monsoon trough overlapped. Some of the season's monsters were not born in the West Pacific at all. They crossed in from the Central Pacific, storms that had begun life in a basin that in normal years barely produces anything, because in 1997 the El Niño had turned the entire central equatorial Pacific into nursery territory. The map of storm origins from that year, laid over a normal year's map, looks like someone grabbed the entire pattern and dragged it a quarter of an ocean eastward, which is, mechanically, exactly what happened. Behind each of those numbers were individual monsters, and the roster still reads like a hall of fame of atmospheric violence. Issa in April, Nestor, Rosie, Winnie in August, whose enormous eye and concentric ring structure made landfall in eastern China and drove flooding deep inland. Bingjiao, Oliwa and Paka, which both wandered in from the Central Pacific, El Niño's relocated nursery in action, with Paka eventually mauling Guam in December, far outside the normal season, with some of the strongest wind gusts ever measured on the island. Keith, Joan, Ivan, storm after storm after storm, month after month, the machine simply refusing to idle. Set the season's totals against the rest of history and the scale becomes almost hard to accept. 10 of 1997's tropical cyclones reached Category 5 equivalent intensity. Winds of at least 157 miles per hour. 10. In a normal year, the entire planet, every basin combined, produces only a small handful of storms at that level. The 1997 West Pacific produced 10 by itself, the most any single basin has ever recorded in one season, a mark that still stands. Hold that against what we're watching in 2026, where 2 Category 5 events in one basin before the season's peak already feels historic. 1997 ran that rate 5 times over and sustained it from spring straight through the following winter. The relentlessness is the part the statistics understate. This was not a season with 2 or 3 headline monsters and a quiet remainder. It was a conveyor that essentially never stopped. One storm forming as another dissipated, the basin rarely without at least one system somewhere on the map for months at a stretch, and the strongest of them clustering not in a single unlucky week but across the entire back half of the year. The forecasters of the day were not tracking an event. They were managing a state of the ocean, one that kept building top-of-scale storms faster than the calendar could clear them, and every one of those storms drew on the same surplus, the same displaced warm pool, the same reorganized atmosphere, the exact mechanism you can watch switching on again right now, 1 plus 2.1 weekly reading at a time. What makes the comparison land is that 1997 was not a warmer world than ours, it was a cooler one. The baseline ocean beneath that record season sat measurably below where the Pacific sits today. 1997 produced the most violent typhoon season ever recorded, off a cooler starting point than the one 2026 is climbing from. That is the uncomfortable arithmetic underneath this entire act. The template year, the season hurricane scientists still treat as the theoretical ceiling of what an El Niño can do to a basin, ran its record on less fuel, in absolute terms, than the ocean is holding right now. And then there is the day that, for my money, captures 1997 better than any season total ever could. October 17th, 1997. On that single day, Super Typhoon Joan was at sea with maximum sustained winds of 185 miles per hour. And Super Typhoon Ivan was also at sea, simultaneously, with maximum sustained winds of 180 miles per hour. 2 separate Category 5 tropical cyclones, both above 180 miles per hour, spinning in the same basin at the same moment. That had never been observed before. It has never been observed since. The planet, as far as we know, has exactly once produced 2 storms of that caliber, alive at the same time in the same ocean, and it did it at the peak of the strongest El Niño of the 20th century. The season did not even respect the calendar on its way out. In December of 1997, December, weeks after typhoon season traditionally winds down, Paka arrived at Guam as a super typhoon and subjected the island to hours of violence, with wind gusts among the strongest ever measured there. The island's power grid was effectively destroyed. Recovery took months. A basin that can deliver a top-of-scale storm to the Marianas in December is a basin whose season simply refused to end because the El Niño feeding it had not peaked yet. The event's maximum came that winter, and the storms track the engine, not the calendar. File that detail away for 2026, whose engine is likewise scheduled to peak in the winter months. The typhoon season of an El Niño year does not necessarily stop when the textbooks say it should. Stop and register what that day means for the claim this video is making. The ocean did not spread its El Niño surplus evenly, producing a fleet of middling typhoons. It concentrated the surplus into the top of the scale, repeatedly, until the top of the scale was crowded. Deep fuel, long runways, wide open permission, the three gifts, compounding across an entire season until the basin was manufacturing simultaneous 180-mile-per-hour storms the way an ordinary October manufactures rain squalls. That is what the completed experiment looks like on the throttle side. 9 named storms by July in 2026 is a fast pace. 1997 is what it looks like when the pace holds through the autumn peak. When the fast start turns out to have been exactly what it appeared to be, the opening stretch of the most energetic storm season ever measured on this planet. But 1997 was running the other half of the experiment too, on the other side of the world at the same time, and the other half is the part that should feel uncomfortably familiar by now. Part 9, The Silent Atlantic of 1997. While the West Pacific was rewriting its record book, the 1997 Atlantic hurricane season was quietly failing to happen. The final tally, 7 tropical storms, 3 hurricanes, only one of them major. Against long-term averages of roughly 10 storms and 6 hurricanes, the season came in at barely half strength, and even that number flatters it, because the storms that did form were mostly brief, weak and forgettable. The basin's accumulated cyclone energy came in at a fraction of a normal year's. The 1997 Atlantic did not produce a single storm that most people alive today could name. The season's few survivors prove the rule by their smallness. The only storm to strike the United States that year was Danny, a minimal hurricane that crawled onto the central Gulf Coast in July and is remembered, to the extent it is remembered at all, for stalling and dumping prodigious rain on parts of the deep south rather than for its wind. A July Gulf storm close to home, defined by rainfall and flooding rather than intensity. If that profile sounds exactly like the 2026 Atlantic's output so far, that is because it is the profile El Niño permits. Homegrown systems, born inside the basin, close to land, in whatever brief local windows the shear allows, while the long-track Cape Verde machinery, the assembly line that builds the historic storms, stays switched off entirely. The one hurricane of any strength that season, Erika in September, formed out in the open Atlantic, briefly reached major status in a pocket of tolerable conditions and bent harmlessly out to sea without seriously threatening land. That was the entire highlight reel of an Atlantic year, one soggy landfall and one offshore curiosity. Put a number on how thoroughly that season failed, using the same energy measure that made the Pacific's record so staggering. Accumulated cyclone energy reward storms that are strong and long-lived. The 1997 West Pacific posted the highest figure ever recorded, 570. The 1997 Atlantic in the same year, on the same planet, posted a small fraction of a single normal season's total, one of the quietest energy years the basin had logged in decades. The same global engine that drove one basin to an all-time maximum drove the other to a near minimum in the same 12 months. If you wanted one pair of numbers to prove that El Niño does not calm the planet, but relocates its violence, those two would be it. One basin at a record high, its mirror at a record low, both readings taken the same year off the same equatorial thermostat. The mechanism behind that empty August was exactly what is standing over the Atlantic tonight. Through the heart of the 1997 season, the subtropical jet ran strong and far south, laying a persistent sheet of hostile upper wind across the main development region, while enhanced sinking air dried and capped the basin from above. The African wave train kept delivering. The seedlings arrived on schedule week after week, and the atmosphere shredded or smothered each one before it could organize. Warm water underneath, live seedlings arriving, and not one of them permitted to grow. It is the same 3-part description you would write for the Atlantic on this morning of July 24th, 2026, almost word for word. Which is the whole reason 1997 sits at the centre of this video rather than in a footnote to it. So the 2026 Atlantic is not merely echoing a quiet year, it is reproducing, ingredient by ingredient, the signature season of the strongest El Niño of the 20th century, and doing it while its own driving index climbs toward that same class, which turns the coming weeks into something like a live experiment with a known control. We already know what the 1997 Atlantic did in August. The only open question is whether 2026 has the discipline to repeat it. But the statistic that defines that season, the one that made it into the textbooks, is what happened in August. Nothing happened in August. Not one tropical cyclone formed in the Atlantic basin during the entire month. No hurricane, no tropical storm, not even a depression. August is the front porch of the Atlantic's peak, the month when the Cape Verde train normally starts delivering. An empty August had not occurred since 1961, 36 years. Forecasters at the time described exactly the atmosphere you would now predict from everything in this video. Relentless wind shear across the deep tropics, sinking dry air smothering the wave train, disturbance after disturbance rolling off Africa into an executioner's basin. The waves came. The ocean was warm enough. Nothing survived. Sound familiar? It should, point for point. 2 storms by late July here, 7 all season there. 0 formation expected through early August here. 0 formation observed through all of August there. Sheer photographed shredding Bertha here. Sheer documented strangling the wave train there. The 2026 Atlantic is not doing something new. It is following the 1997 script so faithfully that the next scene almost writes itself, which is precisely why the August question matters so much this year. If the Atlantic stays empty through August of 2026, it will be reproducing the signature month of the strongest El Niño ever measured, at a moment when this El Niño's index is still climbing toward that event's class. Watch the outlooks. The one sentence forecast through the next 6 weeks are, in a real sense, this El Niño reporting its own strength. And 1997 is not even the only rehearsal of this pattern in living memory. Run the 2015 tape, the most recent Super El Niño, and the same 2 ocean signature appears, with one addition that belongs in this story for what it says about ceilings. The 2015 Atlantic was suppressed and below average, a season of mostly weak, short-lived storms, in which the Caribbean recorded some of the most hostile shear values ever measured there, and system after system approaching from the east simply disintegrated at the graveyard's gate. The West Pacific, meanwhile, ran hyperactive, stacking up super typhoons through summer and autumn, while its own relocated nursery pushed storm origins east across the basin. The 1997 map, redrawn at slightly smaller scale, 18 years later. 2 Super El Niños separated by a generation, each producing the same paired signature on cue, one basin executed, the other unleashed. In a science where clean replication is nearly impossible, the 2-dial fingerprint has now replicated at full strength twice. And 2026 is running the same opening sequence for a 3rd time, and the Eastern Pacific, the 3rd basin, the one directly over the El Niño's displaced heat, produced Hurricane Patricia, a storm that intensified so explosively off the Mexican coast that reconnaissance aircraft measured sustained winds of 215 miles per hour. Patricia remains the strongest tropical cyclone ever reliably measured in the Western Hemisphere. It went from tropical storm to Category 5 in roughly a day. Rapid intensification beyond anything in the forecast models of the time. That is what the top of the envelope looks like when a Super El Niño concentrates its surplus. Not just busy seasons, but individual storms that redefine what forecasters believe the atmosphere can do. And if you zoom all the way out, past the satellite era, the pattern holds at planetary scale in the oldest record we have discussed on this channel. 1877, the famine El Niño, the event that sent Gilbert Walker hunting for the Southern Oscillation in the first place. The instrumental detail is thin that far back, but the global signature is unmistakable in the archives. Monsoon collapse across Asia, drought on 3 continents, and reports consistent with violently disturbed Pacific storm patterns, while tens of millions died in the famines that followed. We told that story in our drought video at the start of this month. The point of invoking it here is narrow but important. The 2-dial engine is not a creature of the satellite era. It is as old as the ocean's configuration, and every time it has run hot in the historical record, it has redrawn the map of where the atmosphere does violence. So, 1997 ran the full experiment. Pacific Dial turned to maximum, 11 super typhoons, the highest ACE ever recorded. Atlantic Dial turned to 0, 7 feeble storms and a silent August. If the story ended there, tonight's video would end here too, with a tidy conclusion about redistribution and a reminder to check back in the fall. But the story did not end there, because in the spring of 1998, the El Niño of the century began to die, and what happened next is the reason this video exists. Part 10. The Loan Comes Due. Super El Niños do not fade politely. They collapse. The same feedback loop that runs away in one direction can run away in the other, and by mid-1998 it was doing exactly that. The Eastern Pacific's fever broke. Cold upwelling resumed off South America, then overshot, the ocean swinging past neutral into a strong La Niña, the cold mirror image, by the second half of the year. In the space of months, the entire global arrangement that had defined 1997 inverted. The displaced thunderstorm engine slid back west. The reorganized jets relaxed, and over the Atlantic, the sheer, the invisible river of hostile wind that had held the basin underwater for a year and a half lifted. What was waiting underneath was an ocean that had spent that entire suppressed season absorbing heat and spending none of it. Understand why the far side of an El Niño is so uniquely dangerous for the Atlantic, because it is more than just the removal of shear. When the pendulum swings hard into La Niña, the atmospheric pattern over the Atlantic does not merely return to neutral. It inverts into the most permissive configuration the basin knows. Shear across the tropics drops below normal. The upper atmosphere relaxes into a state that lets convection tower freely. Every inhibition El Niño imposed gets replaced by its opposite, and this inversion arrives over an ocean that spent the suppressed season doing nothing but absorbing sunlight. Fuel at a maximum, permission at a maximum, arriving together. That is the specific historical trap of the El Niño cycle. It does not alternate between dangerous and safe years. It alternates between years when the Atlantic cannot spend its heat and years when it can spend all of it at once. The 1998 Atlantic season detonated. 14 named storms, 10 hurricanes. The basin went from one of its quietest seasons in decades to one of its most destructive in the span of a single year. The account balance that 1997 never spent paid out with interest. George tore through the Caribbean in September, a long-track major hurricane of exactly the type 1997 could never build, raking Puerto Rico and Hispaniola, killing hundreds across the islands, and carrying its violence all the way to a final landfall on the Gulf Coast. Billions in damage, a chain of devastated islands, and in an ordinary year, George would have been the season's dark headline. In 1998, it was the warm-up act. Because the storm that history remembers, the storm that turned the post-El Niño rebound from a statistical observation into a permanent scar, came in late October. Hurricane Mitch formed in the southwestern Caribbean in the last week of October 1998, over water that had been banking heat all through the quiet year. It intensified with a violence that stunned forecasters. Within days, it was a Category 5 with sustained winds of 180 miles per hour, the same figure Bevy posted over Ruta this month. The number keeps recurring in this story like a bell, and one of the lowest barometric pressures ever measured in the Atlantic to that date. Then, instead of recurving harmlessly out to sea, Mitch's steering collapsed. The storm stalled off the coast of Honduras and, over the better part of a week, wrung itself out against the mountains of Central America. The rain totals defied belief, measured in feet, not inches in places. Mountainsides that had absorbed all they could hold gave way. Entire villages were buried in mudslides or swept down river valleys in the dark. In Nicaragua, days of rain filled the crater lake of the Casita volcano until its flank collapsed, sending a wall of mud kilometers wide down the slope that erased whole communities in minutes. One landslide, from one storm, killing on the scale of a major earthquake. In Honduras, the capital Tegucigalpa flooded street by street as the rivers running through it left their banks. The country's president estimated the storm had undone decades of development in a week. Whole regions lost their roads, their bridges, their crops, their maps. Survivors described landscapes rearranged beyond recognition. When the accounting was finally done, more than 11,000 people were dead, with thousands more never found, and Mitch stood as the deadliest Atlantic hurricane in more than 200 years. you have to go back to the Great Hurricane of 1780 to find a higher toll in this hemisphere's records. The migration wave that followed reshaped Central American demographics for a generation. A single storm on the far side of a quiet season. I want to be precise about the causal chain here, because precision is the difference between insight and superstition. El Niño did not create Mitch, and no serious scientist would say the quiet season of 1997 caused the catastrophe of 1998 in a simple, mechanical way. Hurricanes are individual events with individual causes, a disturbance, a steering pattern, a stretch of warm water, a windless week. What the El Niño cycle did was set the stage. A Caribbean that had run a season and a half with its heat unspent, an atmosphere freshly stripped of the shear that had been policing it, and a rapid swing into La Niña conditions that historically tilt the Atlantic toward its most active and least inhibited state. The El Niño years suppress. The years immediately after, especially when the pendulum swings hard into La Niña, are when the Atlantic historically does its worst work. The quiet is alone. 1998 is what repayment looked like, and notice the timing, because it is the part that should make a person watching the 2026 season sit up. The 1997 El Niño peaked in the winter, around the turn of the year. It decayed through the spring. The La Niña overshoot took hold by mid to late 1998, and Mitch, the repayment, arrived that October, roughly 10 to 12 months after the peak. The bill did not come during the loud year. It came the autumn after the engine died. Now lay that clock over what we have. The 2026 event is forecast to peak this coming winter. Run the same 10 to 12-month fuse from that peak, and it points at the back half of 2027 and into 2028. A window when the Pacific may have already swung toward La Niña, the Atlantic shear may already have lifted, and the heat this basin is banking right now, unspent, would still be sitting in the water waiting. That is not a forecast of a specific storm. No one can make that forecast. It is a statement about when the historical trap has sprung before, mapped onto the calendar we're actually on. And it was not a one-time pattern. Watch the same pendulum swing 2 decades later. The 2015 Super El Niño suppressed the Atlantic exactly per the playbook. The event collapsed through 2016. The shear lifted, the banked heat remained. And the first fully unleashed season on the far side, 2017, produced Harvey, Irma and Maria inside 6 weeks. A flood that drowned Houston under feet of rain, a Category 5 that raked the Caribbean end to end, and a storm that destroyed Puerto Rico's grid and killed thousands in the aftermath. Roughly $300 billion in damage from a single season, at the time the costliest in American history. 2 Super El Niños in the modern record, 2 suppressed Atlantic seasons, 2 rebounds that produced generation-defining catastrophe within 2 years of the El Niño's peak. There is a cruel psychology folded into this pattern, and it is worth naming, because it is part of why the rebound keeps catching people unprepared. A quiet season does not simply fail to cause damage, it actively lowers everyone's guard. Coastal residents relax, insurers breathe easier, the seasonal forecast that flagged a calm year gets filed as correct, and the assumption hardens that the danger has passed for a while. Then the engine flips. The shear lifts off a basin that has been hoarding heat the whole time, and the first major hurricane in 2 years arrives at a coastline that spent that entire stretch being told the ocean was calm. The quiet does not just defer the danger, it disarms the people standing in front of it. That is the specific trap of the post-El Niño rebound. The year that lulls you and the year that hits you are consecutive, and the lull is part of the machinery of the hit. Which is why a below-average seasonal forecast, the kind NOAA issued for the Atlantic this year, is one of the most easily misread documents in all of weather. It is accurate. It is also, if you read it as an all-clear instead of a delay, exactly the wrong lesson to take from a basin, quietly banking fuel behind a wall of borrowed wind. That is the pattern with which 2026 now rhymes, and it reframes everything in the first half of this video, the empty 7-day outlook, the 15-day model silence, the waves dying quietly south of the Azores. Every week of Atlantic quiet this year is not a week of danger cancelled. On the historical evidence, it is a week of danger deferred into a basin that is warmer at baseline than it was in 1997 or 2015, holding its unspent heat against the day the shear lifts. Nobody can tell you which year the repayment comes or what it will be named. The record simply says, it has come every time, and it has never come small. Which raises the question of how big the loan itself is still getting. Because the size of the eventual swing depends on the size of the event now building, and the 2026 El Niño has not stopped growing. Part 11. The number still climbing. Every El Niño gets reduced in the end to a single number, and that number has a line drawn across it where the vocabulary changes. We built the lower rungs of that ladder earlier tonight. Cross plus 0.5 at the peak and it is an official El Niño. Cross plus 1.5 and forecasters start using the word strong. There is one rung above that, and it is the one that matters now. Cross plus 2.0, and the event graduates into the class meteorologists informally call a super El Niño. In the entire modern record, the satellite and buoy era, reaching back to the 1950s, that top line has been crossed exactly 3 times. 1982 into 83, peaking near plus 2.2, back before the buoy array existed to watch it properly, catching forecasters largely by surprise. 1997 into 98, the year you just spent 2 acts standing inside, peaking near plus 2.4, the first super event ever observed from birth to death by modern instruments. And 2015 into 16, the strongest of the 3 by the traditional measure, cresting around plus 2.6. 3 super events in roughly 70 years. Each one reached off a strip of equatorial ocean and bent the weather of every inhabited continent for a year or more. Now lay 2026 against that line, and be careful how you read the number, because the intuitive reading is the wrong one. The official seasonal index, the 3-month average I've quoted all night, sits at plus 0.98, against a super threshold of plus 2 that looks like a comfortable gap, a moderate event with a long climb still ahead of it. But that seasonal figure is a rearview mirror. It averages April, May and June together, and it is dragged down by how cool the ocean still was in early spring, at the very start of the run. It is not telling you where the Pacific is tonight. It is telling you where the Pacific was, on average, a season ago. Look at the fresher measurements, and the gap collapses. By June alone, the monthly value had already climbed to roughly plus 1.5. Strong territory on the monthly scale. And the newest weekly readings from the Niño 3.4 region, the leading edge of the data rather than the 3-month smear trailing behind it, have already spiked past plus 2.0, touching around plus 2.1 this month. Read that against the threshold again. The seasonal average still says moderate, because a lagging average always understates a fast-rising signal. The live ocean, measured this week, is already posting values that belong to the super category outright, and it is doing it in July, with the event's own climatological peak still 4 to 6 months down the road. El Niño almost always reaches its maximum in the middle of Northern Hemisphere winter. Everything you have watched this engine do to 2 oceans, it has done while still warming up toward a summit it will not touch until the turn of the year. The velocity itself is part of the warning. A garden variety El Niño ambles up its ladder over the better part of a year. This one went from La Niña to the doorstep of super status in about 6 months, and the spread between its lagging seasonal number and its live weekly number, plus 0.98 against plus 2.1, is not noise. It is the signature of an ocean still accelerating. The readings fanning apart precisely because the front edge is climbing faster than the average behind it can keep up. When the trailing average and the leading edge diverge that far, the trailing average is not the truth. It is the part of the story that already happened, and the 3 prior super events tell you what the far end of that climb can look like, because none of them was gentle. 1982 into 83 arrived almost unannounced. The monitoring network of the day barely saw it coming, and still went on to trigger devastating drought and fire in Australia and catastrophic flooding along the America's Pacific coast. 1997 into 98, the one we have spent this whole video inside, was the first that scientists watched build in real time with modern instruments, and it peaked near plus 2.4 while producing the record typhoon season and the silent Atlantic you already know. 2015 into 16 climbed highest of all by the traditional index, cresting around plus 2.6, and left its own trail of relocated storms and a shattered global temperature record in its wake. 3 events, 3 different starting points, 1 shared trait. Every time the index has pushed past plus 2, the planet has paid for it on multiple continents at once. 2026 is now standing at that same doorway in July, with the door still opening, and by the relative measure that strips out global warming, matching the pace of the strongest of them. So the forecasters have looked ahead, and they have done it, by their own account, with unusual confidence for this stage of an event. Remember the spring predictability barrier from earlier? The blind spot that made this El Niño so hard to see coming last winter? That barrier is behind us now. Once an event is established and climbing through summer, the models steady and converge, and the outlooks they are issuing for the winter peak are the kind forecasters are willing to put their names on. Those outlooks carry the 2026 event to a maximum late this year or at the start of the next, in the November to January window, and they place the magnitude of that peak in territory that would not merely make this a fourth Super El Niño. Several forecast groups now put the projected peak at or beyond the level of any El Niño in the reliably measured record. Not one of the three biggest. Potentially the biggest since continuous measurement began. There is an honest complication buried in that claim, and this channel does not walk past complications, least of all this one, because when you work it through, it makes the story stronger rather than weaker. A sharp skeptic could ask a fair question. If the entire global ocean is warmer than it used to be, and it is, we covered June arriving as the warmest ocean surface ever measured just a couple of weeks ago, then isn't part of that +2 reading simply the background warming of the whole planet, smuggled into the El Niño scorecard? Are we measuring El Niño, or are we measuring climate change wearing an El Niño costume? The scientists monitoring this event asked themselves exactly that, and their answer was to build a stricter ruler. Alongside the traditional index which measures the Niño region against a fixed 20th century average, they now track a relative index, one that compares the Niño region only against the rest of the warmed tropical ocean surrounding it. It subtracts the global signal out. It asks not how hot the El Niño zone is compared to the cooler planet of decades past, but how much hotter it is than its own present-day neighbourhood. It is, by design, the more conservative number. And by that stricter relative measure, with the background warming stripped away, 2026 is running neck and neck with 1997 for the strongest El Niño ever recorded at this point in the calendar. Take the planetary warming out of the accounting entirely, and the event is still standing shoulder to shoulder with the El Niño of the century. The +2 is not a bookkeeping illusion. The equatorial Pacific really is doing this. Now fold the two facts together, because it is their combination that has no precedent anywhere in the record. The relative index says the El Niño itself is genuinely historically strong, not an artifact of a warm planet, but a real, top-tier event, and the absolute ocean beneath it is the warmest ever measured. Every prior Super El Niño spun up over a cooler planet than this one, and each still killed tens of thousands of people and rewrote weather across every continent. 2026 is assembling a comparable engine on top of a baseline hotter than any of them ever had underneath it. And here is where that connects straight back to the storms. A tropical cyclone draws its fuel from the absolute temperature of the water, not from an anomaly printed on a chart. A super typhoon does not read the index. It reads the heat content of the ocean it is sitting on. And in absolute terms, that heat content has never, not in 1997, not in 2015, not once before, been this high beneath a strengthening Super El Niño, which turns the two-basin split you have watched all night into something other than a finished picture. The dead Atlantic and the Category 5 factory are what this machine produces at +0.98 seasonal, with the live ocean only now touching +2 in July, still climbing. Everything in this video is a snapshot taken partway up the mountain. The dial is still turning toward its peak. If this is the fingerprint the engine presses onto the planet at the start of its run, the only rational question left is what it presses down at the summit, and what a completed Super El Niño, launched from the hottest ocean in the history of measurement, actually does to the world when it stops charging and starts to pay out. We have the answer to that too. The same year that taught us the record typhoon season and the silent August also measured, from beginning to end, what the peak of a Super El Niño costs, in lives far from any coastline, long after the storms have stopped. Part 12. What comes due? The storms are the part of an El Niño you can see. They are not the part that kills the most people. For 2 acts, this video has treated 1997 as a story about typhoons and a silent Atlantic, because those are the pieces that map cleanly onto what we are watching in 2026. but the Super El Niño of 1997 and 98 did its greatest killing far from any storm track, in slow motion, through the one weapon an El Niño wields that no single hurricane can match. It moves the rain. When the warm pool and its perpetual thunderstorms slide east into the central Pacific, the places that depended on that rising air being overhead lose it, and the places that spent millennia being dry suddenly have an ocean venting heat and moisture into the sky above them. Entire continents get their weather rewired at once, and the rewiring lasts for months. Follow that rewiring around the planet for that one event. On the west coast of South America, in Peru and Ecuador, the newly superheated eastern Pacific dumped torrential rain onto deserts. Rivers appeared in valleys that see almost no water in an ordinary year, and the resulting floods and landslides killed hundreds and drove entire towns from their homes. Directly across the Pacific, Indonesia and the surrounding tropics lost their rising air and fell into severe drought. The forests dried until they burned, in fires so large the smoke closed airports and choked hospitals across Southeast Asia for weeks on end. California, on the northern arm of the same displaced storm track, took a winter of relentless atmospheric rivers and lethal flooding. And the cold, nutrient-rich upwelling off South America, the same upwelling El Niño switches off, stayed shut down long enough that the anchovy fishery feeding a huge share of the world's fish meal collapsed, sending shocks through global food markets a hemisphere away. When researchers later tried to total the human cost of the 1997 into 98 event across all of these fronts at once, the estimates ran to roughly 23,000 deaths worldwide and tens of billions of dollars in damage. Almost none of that toll came from the record typhoon season. It came from the rain moving. The physical mechanism is worth making concrete because it is the same displacement that runs the storms, only read through rainfall instead of wind. Normally the rising branch of the Pacific's circulation, that perpetual curtain of thunderstorms, sits over the western warm pool, which is why Indonesia and the surrounding tropics are among the wettest places on Earth, while the eastern Pacific stays desert dry. When El Niño drags the warm water and its thunderstorms east, the rising air travels with them. The western tropics, left under sinking air, dry out and burn. The eastern Pacific and the Americas Pacific coast, suddenly under rising air where there is normally none, flood. Nothing is created and nothing is destroyed. The planet's single largest rain factory slides a few thousand miles east and stays there for a year, and everyone who lives at the old address or the new one pays for the move. The storms are this same story told in wind. The famines and the floods are it told in water, and there is a delayed effect that reaches everyone, coastline or not. An El Niño is, at bottom, the ocean handing its stored heat to the atmosphere, and the atmosphere runs a fever for a year or two afterward. The hottest years in the entire global temperature record are the years that follow strong El Niño peaks. The ocean pays out its banked heat, and global air temperature spikes in the wake. 1998 held the title of hottest year on record for years afterward, riding the El Niño that drove it. 2016 took the title in its turn, following the 2015 event. If the 2026 event peaks this winter anywhere near the magnitude now being forecast, 2027 becomes the leading candidate to break the global record again, and it would break it from the warmest baseline ever measured, with the largest heat handover in the modern record stacked on top. The storms resolve in days. This part resolves over the following 2 years, on every thermometer on the planet, and the reach of it is the part that is hard to hold in your head, because an El Niño of this size does not send a single disaster somewhere. It sends a different disaster almost everywhere at once, each one tuned to the local climate it lands on. The same displaced warm pool that drowns the Peruvian desert starves the Indonesian rainforest. The same reorganized jet that floods California can wither crops in southern Africa and shift the monsoon over India. In the 2015 into 16 event, the most recent Super El Niño, the one that gave us Patricia and set up the 2017 Atlantic, southern Africa fell into one of its worst droughts in decades. Coral reefs bleached across entire ocean basins as the heat pooled, and 2016 went on to shatter the global temperature record on the back of it. 2 super events, a generation apart, and both wrote the same signature across the whole planet. Storms relocated, rainfall relocated, and a global fever that outlived every storm involved. That is the class of event 2026 is now climbing into, off a baseline neither of those two ever had beneath it. None of it is new to the age of satellites either. The oldest El Niño we have talked about on this channel, the famine event of 1877 that first sent Gilbert Walker hunting for the pattern, killed on a scale that dwarfs everything since tens of millions dead across Asia and beyond when the monsoon failed and the rains walked away, as we covered in the drought video earlier this month. The engine is old. The only thing new about 2026 is the height of the water it is running on. So carry all of it back to the two oceans we started with, and to the two things actually worth watching in the days and weeks right after this video goes out. Because both of them are this El Niño reporting its own strength, out loud, in real time. The first is the storm already turning toward China. Nool is forecast to come ashore on the Guangdong coast, in the Pearl River Delta region, within about 2 days of this video going live, and the official forecast tops it out as a strong tropical storm climbing toward minimal typhoon strength, with landfall somewhere along the southern coast between Saturday night and Sunday morning, and rainfall totals in the range of 20 inches in the heaviest bands. But you have heard the refrain of this whole Pacific season by now. Sinlaku outran its forecast. Bavi outran its forecast on the way to 180 miles per hour. Nool is crossing the same anomalously hot ocean, and there is open speculation among storm watchers that its true ceiling runs far higher than the official number, Category 4 or beyond, if its core comes off Luzon intact. Within the first weekend this video is online, the ocean will tell you which number it chose. Watch it. It is a single legible reading of how hard this engine is running. The second is quieter, and it will not trend anywhere, because it is the absence of a thing rather than the thing itself. Watch the National Hurricane Center's tropical outlooks through August. In 1997, the strongest El Niño of the 20th century produced an Atlantic August with 0 named storms, the first empty August in 36 years. If 2026 reproduces that signature, if the one-sentence forecasts keep coming back clean week after week through the belly of the season, then the 2026 Atlantic is not merely quiet. It is tracing the exact footprint of a super El Niño in real time, while the index driving it is still climbing toward that class. A blank outlook is not nothing. It is the machine signing its work. Because that is the truth this whole video has been circling. The silence in the Atlantic and the violence in the Pacific were never two stories. They are one fingerprint, pressed onto opposite sides of the planet by one engine with 2 dials. An engine that is still, tonight, turning itself up. The Category 5 factory and the dead basin are the loud half and the quiet half of the same signal, and the history could not be clearer about which half to fear more in the long run. The loud half spends its energy as fast as it makes it, storm by storm, and the ocean cools a little in each storm's wake. The quiet half saves. Every empty week in the Atlantic this year is a week the basin's heat goes unspent, banked under a lid of hostile wind that the record promises will not stay in place forever. 1997 banked a year and a half of it, and the account was drained in a single week in the mountains of Honduras. 2015 banked its own, and the withdrawal came 2 autumns later, under 3 names nobody on the Gulf Coast has been allowed to forget. 2026 is making the same deposit right now in real time on this morning's blank forecast, and it is making it into a basin warmer than 1997's or 2015's ever were, while the engine driving the whole arrangement climbs toward the strongest reading ever measured. The Pacific is showing you its half of the bill tonight, in a storm turning toward Hong Kong. The Atlantic is hiding its half behind a week of empty maps. So the question to carry out of this video is not why the Atlantic has gone silent. You know why now. The question is the one nobody can answer yet. When this engine finally winds down, and the wind that has held the Atlantic underwater all year lifts off an ocean that has done nothing the entire time but store heat, what climbs out of the water on the far side, and whose coastline is standing where it decides to come ashore?